So this is the Third Armored Division from Storm in the West 1944. It's received some changes from its vanilla incarnation. The equipment is largely the same, but it's a lot of things are different in this mod. So I'll try to go into it in terms of a comparison between this division in Storm in the West and this division in Steel Division. The big difference you're going to see right here is the income curve is it's pretty sharper up, whereas it started low and it was mediocre and then really high. It's okay, decent, and pretty good and good. The main thing about Storm of the West 44 is that the phase um, lengths have changed. So for most divisions, Phase A is 12 minutes, Phase B is 15 minutes, and then Phase C in the standard 40-minute game is 13 minutes. So there are a few divisions where this is different, but most divisions have this loadout. So Phase B is now the longest phase in a standard game, which means Phase B income and Phase B availability is actually quite important. And Third Armored is fairly balanced in that respect. Also of note that is not shown here is that divisions like Third Armored also get bonus points at the beginning of Phase B and especially at the beginning of Phase C. Fairly significant. I believe this is 250, but Chris can correct me on that. So let's get into this division to start with. So the recon tab is fairly standard. It's about what you saw before, except so you have M8 Greyhounds, which are a little bit cheaper than they are. Their speed is more of an advantage in the mod because everything else is slower, but they retain a pretty good speed for a vehicle like that. Main gun engaged at 1500 like every other gun, but it's weaker. Light anti-tank guns in general are weaker in this mod, and this is no change from that. It also has two front armor, which is quite low in the mod, meaning autocannons are a serious threat to these vehicles, but they're still pretty useful. They're cheap. They have two machine guns. They can fight other vehicles. All around pretty good. You have your standard scout, four-man scout squad. Very good stealth, unlike the two-man squads. In vanilla, only the two-man squads had the very good stealth, but these are uh, now the difference is you get a carrier with the two-man, which is a little 50 cal vehicle. And yes, 50 cows have a small AP value, but due to the scaling, it only really ever goes up to 2, and you have to get pretty close for that to get 2. Alright, let's get into the infantry tab. Armored leaders haven't changed. Half tracks are a little bit cheaper in general in this mod because it's easier to kill light vehicles. Um, they have the M1917, and yeah, you'll see the standard half track with a machine gun is 10 points. It was 20 or it was 15 for the guards. Armored, also the MG teams are cheaper. They're not as dominant over normal weapons, but they're cheaper. They're kind of a inexpensive way to provide long range fire support, but probably not needed in this division though. Armored rifles have been adjusted to more of a standard loadout. Previously, they were one of the worst squads in the game. Now they're one of the more versatile ones. They have a light machine gun now. They have a submachine gun now, as well as their standard bazooka. They come in a M3 half track, good morale. The bazooka's nerfed from what used to be in vanilla. It has a shorter range and less AP, but it's still valuable to keep vehicles from bullying you. Um, Also, the BAR, far from being worthless in this mod, is significantly better than it was. They're Allied light machine guns are generally better in this mod. They're not better than the German ones, but they're better than they were, uh, and they're more important in general. So you have good availability on armored rifles. You have, your engineer leaders, da da da, same thing, same thing. Engineers, not much different, except no LMGs is more of a problem for this squad. It's more of a close combat specialist now. It's not quite the amazing value it used to be in vanilla. This is still a good squad. 2 LMGs, excellent. Not much for machine gun, and they come in a 50 cal half track. They're a little bit cheaper than they used to be. Other than that, it's basically the same old stuff. Armored rifles or engineers. These engineers come in a truck. Very standard infantry loadout for an armored division. So the Americans, this division has Stuarts now. Well, of course it had Stuarts, but the veterancy on the Stuarts doesn't mean as much. It's more of a morale thing than they don't have the elite crews like many of the German tanks do. But it's still pretty good value at 75 points. It's immune to the very light anti-tank guns and autocannons, can fight vehicles pretty well, and has 3 machine guns for good fire support. They're also fairly quick, especially off-road. You have a couple of Shermans in Phase 8, just like the Vanilla Division, except Shermans aren't quite as good. Shermans have a much lower AP on their main gun, and a little bit less armor, but they're cheaper. Instead of like 130, now they're 100, which means that they're more ubiquitous. It's easier to buy them, but they're not as good. They're worse than Panzer IVs and Stugs. But they're pretty useful for fire support. They can fight tanks in advantageous situations. They don't have the aim time that they used to, but they're still pretty good. And one of the things about this mod is that on-road speed for tanks isn't that much higher than off-road speed, so it's often quite good to just take them off-road and drive off-road with them rather than be stuck to the roads. It can help you avoid ambushes and other things. Other than that, the Shermans are the bread and butter of this division. You have early model Shermans, which have a little bit less armor and a little bit more dispersion on their high explosive rounds. But overall, they're fairly similar. That's why it's only like 5 points more. You do get 9 armor instead of 8, which is a little bit more protection. They have good morale. American tanks have good morale. They believed in their equipment, and they did believe in their equipment, and there weren't morale problems in the U.S. armor. Sherman 76s aren't nearly as godlike as they used to be, but they're also much cheaper. They do not have the special ammunition, but they are every bit. They're better than the Panzer IV, and they're actually a little bit cheaper than Panzer IVs. But they're less available. So you have your standard command tank, command Shermans, non-command, and you have jumbos in Phase C. Phase C isn't as long, so it isn't as consequential. The jumbo is kind of a pain to kill, but it doesn't have a lot of firepower. And it only comes in Phase C, which is a bit rough, but I think this was done when Phase C was longer. Anyway, you could probably make this Phase B without much pain. Overall, this is a pretty good Allied tank tab. You have most of the things you need. It is sometimes frustrating to play without 17-pounders because you don't have that easy answer to heavy tanks, but you just have to keep the tempo going with this division. Alright, this one you have the standard Jeep 50, meh. Flamethrower teams, you have to use them in conjunction with other squads. M20 Command, just a standard command vehicle. M8 Scots, good in close quarters, good infantry support, not much else. They actually have an AP round, which means they are dangerous when they're close enough. But this is not a substitute for a Stuart. Supply. Sherman 105, very good. Once again, very good support inaccurate. By that AP-13 is a little bit deceptive because the main gun is not very accurate, and it doesn't have a lot of AP shells in the first place. It's a heat weapon. Less range than tank guns. I don't generally use these, but they do have value as support pieces, similar to the Cromwell support pieces in other armored divisions. Same thing through phase C. Anti-tank guns. So in a relative sense, the 6 pounder got better because the 6 pounder is now better than the Sherman's main gun against tanks. AP9. It also has special ammo, I believe APDS ammo for even closer range. AP-15 means you can penetrate heavy tanks at closer range. It's good. It's accurate. It moves okay. M10, very useful. You get them starting in Phase A, reflecting the fact that the 3rd Armored had 2 tank destroyer battalions with it in Normandy. It had 1 through most of the Western campaign, but in Normandy it had 2. And yeah, in vanilla it did not have these M10s, but it does now. Eugen decided in the vanilla that they would get a towed tank destroyer battalion to give them some variety, but that's not really historical. They had a self-propelled tank destroyer battalions, 2 of them. So the M10 in the mod is basically the equivalent of the Panzer IV. It has a AP-10 main gun, can penetrate most German mediums. Has an AP-19 HVAP round, which is good at close-in ambushes against heavy tanks. You want these when you're up against heavy tanks. These are very critical with American battle groups. The British M10s don't have HVAP, by the way. So you'll have to use these guys are your best bet against Tigers and Panthers. These are somewhat useful for ambushes, but you need to be careful with them. A Tiger can easily knock it out at max range, just given some time. Good M10s, no elite crews in this division because this wasn't the veteran division. If it was the 2nd Armored, I would say there should be some elite crews in this, but this is a division whose first battle was Normandy. Anti-air is fairly standard American options. They're not as effective in the mod as they are in vanilla. This one is probably what you want. With the Bofors gun and the 50 cals. They are good fire support vehicles, but they're fairly vulnerable to just about anything. Artillery. By the way, Axis air power isn't quite as much as it is in vanilla, so this is less necessary. For artillery, you have most of the same options as before. You have a foot 81mm, foot 60s in half tracks, which you had before. Half track mounted mortars. You do have a Sherman off map, and this is a real Sherman, so it do Sherman things as well as fire a single off map bombardment. And off map vehicles have 1 shot with their bombardment, so just think about it like that. The bombardments are fairly effective. But you get 1 shot with them. Then you get the priests and the Calliope in phase C. Usually when it's too late, but the priests are useful in knocking out anti-tank guns and counter-battering enemy artillery. Of course, in the mod they have 5,000 meter range, which basically means they can be anywhere on the map, no problem. Otherwise, it's a fairly standard US artillery tab. Oh, the air tab, one of the big differences, of course I explained in the mod description, is that it has a common air tab with most other allied battle groups. So you'll see a lot of options. Like, you have tons of options. Now, this isn't a high access air deck, so it doesn't have all the options, but, you have rockets, good bombs, even better bombs, good fighters. You have the B-26 Strafer if you want. a lot of options for your air tab. Uh, this is, I think this is the general Allied loadout. You have plenty of fighters, plenty of bombers, whatever you really need, you can get. They are a little bit more expensive in the well. Some bombers are more expensive, some are less. They're more similar to one another in cost. I would say that's how I describe planes. You're basically choosing more based on your reload time and preference than cost. Anyway, this is the summary of the 3rd Armored in the Storm in the West 44 mod. I hope I got into its differences with the vanilla one, and yeah, this is probably one of the more standard divisions in the mod. It doesn't really have that crazy curve that it has in vanilla, and you know, it has fairly average stuff. It's about what you'd expect from an American Armored division. If you keep the tempo on, you can usually win just about anything. Alright, well, thank you for watching my YouTube channel, and take care.